Thank you, everybody, for joining us today as we continue our webinar series that it feels like we've been doing for years now throughout the pandemic that has just gone on for too long. Today, we're going to be talking about protecting your institution from Russian cyber activity that we've seen an increased uptick in lately. Next slide, Armando. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kelly Sinicola, Executive Vice President of Professional Services here at Forelli. If you do have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to put those into the chat window. You have entered with your microphone on mute. Please keep it there until the end if we have time for questions. And we will send a link to this recording following the webinar for reference, so feel free to take notes, but just know that you're going to get a copy as well. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So today presenting, we have Armando and Chris. Armando and Chris, would you like to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Certainly, thank you very much. My name is Armando Denorio. I'm the CISO and Senior Consultant here at Forelli. I've had many years working in education and working under cybersecurity.
Chris?
Yeah, and my name is Chris Mallory. I am the Director of the Security Cloud and Infrastructure practice here at Forelli. And so our team of experts helps a lot of higher education customers, specifically with some of their security needs and concerns.
So one of the things that we always want to address is keeping humans first, going through and it's been definitely a tough couple of years. Employees were already under stress with current pandemic and disruptions that have caused long-term and hard to reverse impacts. So keep an eye out for employee burnout, lower trust, lower inclusion. Just because we've had to change our ways, our business ways, our workflows to incorporate everything that's happening in regards from working from home to changing, making changes and also different ways that we communicate. So employees have had lots of stress already. Talking about adjusting and going through that process and having to even learn new collaboration tools to communicate. The other part that we need to make sure we address is managing the cybersecurity side. And the National Cyber Awareness System sends out alerts going through and increasing awareness and keeping the information so that we can take a look at summaries of attacks, things that are happening, and they give a great explanation of what's going through these types of attacks and specific release information that can give you a lot, and your security folks, a lot of data to help with increasing your defensive measures. As you can see, these are just some examples of the awareness systems and the information in regards to the recent activity from destructive malware targeting organizations in the Ukraine, but also keeping an eye out and raising the awareness in regards to the cyber attacks because they tend to spill over and unintentionally go to other targets, and keeping that in mind, that's why everyone's so nervous of what may happen, and especially with the cyber attack activity increasing. So one of the big things that we want to help raise awareness is checking the default multi-factor authentication settings. A recent advisory warns organizations that the Russian state actors are looking through and have accessed companies and institutions through exploitation of the default settings and known vulnerabilities to increase the lateral movement and give them the option to move within a network. This was just a recent post from a Bleeping Computer, just warning with giving that information and raising awareness from that perspective. This particular cyber awareness was recently from March 15th. It goes through and explains that exploitation that we were talking about and the vulnerability, which was a known vulnerability called Print Nightmare in the past. And even though it's something that was known for a long while, those with institutions or environments that are not fully patching, those vulnerabilities become gateways to moving laterally within an environment. It's important to go ahead and go through and implement layers of defense, techniques and programs. There is no silver bullet. Unfortunately, at the same time, there's layers of defense that we need to put in place. We need to make sure that we put programs and defensive techniques to completely help prevent cyber attacks. Properly implemented, these defenses are going to make it difficult for the threat actors to get into your network and encounter. You want to make them encounter complex defensive barriers, and defenses should also look at triggering alarms so that you can prevent, have mechanisms that prevent and enable your organization to identify, contain, respond to an incident, and help you respond quickly. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the tactics, techniques, and procedures?
Sure. The CISA keeps a catalog of known. Let's see here. Oh yes. CISA keeps a catalog of tactics, techniques, and procedures, and essentially these are the ways in which threat actors are observed to gather information. It basically takes you through several steps. They gather information about your organization. They gain initial access. It kind of goes through a continuum of steps, and if you stop, if you're able to stop the threat actor anywhere along the way, you disrupt the actual effective, successful cyber attack.
As you can see here, they actually break down the techniques, and they also have references to what they're pointing to in the MITRE attack framework. So these numbers here associate to help you understand the attack. They give an example of the procedure for each step, and then an associated tactic that's detailed. When you actually go into the MITRE attack framework, as you can see here, it actually breaks it down from the attack perspective, the different reconnaissance, their resource, the execution, the persistence. So it actually breaks the attack down, and each one of these gives an explanation of each step that they're trying to achieve as the adversaries move through their attack. So it's a very good way to try and understand how the attackers are trying to engage, and what you can do to prevent some of these tactics and techniques from fruition, basically. So you want to follow best practices and observe those TTPs. And some of the things that you can do to take action today is require multi-factor authentication, set your antivirus and anti-malware programs to make sure they run regular scans and you have regular reviews. Use strong spam filters, preventing phishing emails, because those are usually the first wave of attack to actually phish for credentials, and making sure that end users are trained as well as made aware of these tactics, filtering your network traffic, and last but not least, and probably the most important part, is updating all your software and hardware included in that matter. The CISA also has some known exploited vulnerabilities. So taking on the importance of understanding what those vulnerabilities are, they actually post a list of information that helps go through each type of vulnerability that they find. In this case, this one was updated just recently, March 3rd, and they added 95 known exploit vulnerabilities to their list.
That's an especially important list to look at, because out of all of the vulnerabilities that exist, these are on a list that are known to be exploited. Not all vulnerabilities that are recognized are being exploited in the wild, but these ones are noted to be. So it's an extra important list to keep track of.
Indeed, this one actually just came out on the 15th, and it was concentrating, as you can see, on the Microsoft Windows side, and taking a look at all the vulnerabilities within that. These are actually actively being utilized, so they increased the awareness by posting this one here. And then you have, going through those, they actually have additional information that can help your security and network teams to help actually block known indicators of compromise. These are known domains, known IP addresses, and as you can see, they're not just originating from Russia, they're also originating from other countries, and the list keeps growing as they take over other compromised systems. So making sure that you take a look at these and go through the process of blocking those IOCs, indicators of compromise, immediately is a best practice. Review the logs related to those IP addresses and investigate any activity that you find, because those are usually are your best indicators that something is happening, possibly happening in your network, and document all that you have configured. Use ports to take a look at isolating the activity related to those IP addresses, and report any compromises suspected to the authorities. This website here actually gives a link and contact information to the authorities, and you can help communicate what's happening there. Looking at from a cybersecurity infrastructure security agency and the FBI, again, they're warning that the organizations out there are utilizing data wiping attacks, targeting Ukraine. And in the past, we've seen that there has been spillover when such attacks have happened. So the awareness to increase our security postures is prevalent. And at the same time, we should be ready to prevent such devastating attacks from occurring on our systems. So making sure that the intentional spillover is most likely to happen. So that's why they want to raise the awareness as much as possible. What comes into play, even and more importantly, is making sure that you're prepared for planning, preparation, detection, and most importantly, even response is very important.
Yeah, so an ounce of prevention is a much better investment than a pound of cure. I think we would all agree on that. So now it's time to make your user community and your leadership aware of this increased risk and use it as a driver to move the needle forward and improve your cybersecurity posture. So we're going to go over some best practices to focus on. So we're going to start with account control. So things like let's go ahead and implement principal of least privilege wherever we can. If you don't have access or you don't need access to a particular resource, it shouldn't be something that you have access to. So trying to follow that principle wherever possible is an excellent recommendation. For computer administrators, like local administrators in particular, that's an issue in a lot of higher education space. Everyone's a local administrator on their machine. Let's deny access to logging in from the network and over remote desktop when it isn't necessary, leaving only the local interactive session available, and that helps limit that lateral movement if a machine gets compromised. Let's remove unnecessary accounts and groups. So if there's an account or a group that allows login to resources beyond what is needed, then let's remove those. And be sure to make use of the protected users Active Directory group so that cache credentials, if a privileged user is signed into a machine and they aren't in that group, it's likely they left behind their cache credentials. So a local copy of that password is essentially able to be dumped from that machine and then used to sign into other machines because it's a privileged account.
One of the big things to make sure that you're doing is your end user education. End users are the front line of security in the organization. As you can see from some recent statistics from egress, that 58% of alerts to the IT leaders, to the IT groups are alerted by employees by a mixture of self-reporting or even other employees not involved directly in a breach or an incident. So it's very important to go through and make sure to educate the security principles as well as the actions to take or not to take, and go through the awareness process of teaching them that to be cautious of downloads of third-party sites to vendors, to recognize phishing emails since they're usually the first point of attack, and identify individuals to contact. What is the process that you have? Since the human eye, when you have so many folks, especially when you have a big organization, you can actually get a lot faster notifications and awareness to things that might be happening. So they can take the way that they actually go through and suspect an incident and why it's happening. So the end users are very important and helping. As you can see, it takes a village to fight cybercrime. It's not just the technology that does it, it's also the folks and the people that are there in the organization. Taking a look at allow lists is very important. Enable application directly allow lists, utilizing Microsoft's software restriction policy or even app locker will help. Using directory allow lists will also go through and help with organizing what's should be used, what can be used on the network. and how those applications actually get installed. This allow all these other locations, unless an exception is definitely granted, but knowing that allowing them only to install in certain program folders will help identify and standardize, and also easier to alert if something is happening.
All right, backups. So making sure, so the premise of the a lot of what we're seeing from Russia is, it's going to be deletion, malware. It's going to delete data, or it's going to encrypt data, which is essentially making it inaccessible to you. So backups are a very, very, very important aspect to maintaining, the continuity of the organization. And so
I'd like to add another very into that.
Sure.
No, I was just saying I'd like to add another very to all the varies that you actually add.
Okay, all right, very good. And so it's important to know what you're backing up, and to make sure that what you're backing up includes those essential systems to keep your operation running should you encounter trouble. Make sure you're backing up regularly. Make sure you're testing those backups. Do restores from all of the media where you might need to restore from in an emergency. Your organization might have a mix of backup to a disk-based appliance, maybe backup to tape, maybe backup to cloud. All of those need to be tested, because it's not the time to find out that it isn't working. Isn't when you have a crisis. So create offline backups, or use a solution that has that stores those backups in an immutable form. What we're looking for here is the situations where your systems are destroyed, whether that's a physical situation like a fire, flood, some actual theft, but also we're talking about ransomware. So if you have your sole backup copies are online somewhere, then that ransomware can encrypt your backups, and that's a very common tactic today. So in addition, we can't just have last night's backups. We need to have adequate recovery points in time from which you can restore, and that's important. So we're looking for at least 6 months worth of data, depending on your data retention requirements, and and that gets a less and less granularity as time goes on. But having several backups for a short period of time in the past, and then a little less granular, maybe weeklies or monthlies beyond that. But having the ability to give yourself several recovery points is going to be critical in a crisis.
Yeah, I can't go through and stress the importance of testing. Make sure you test those backups. Make sure you get your folks into a regular routine of trying to test recovering a system, so that they don't have to be so stressed when they're trying to actually have to go through the process in an urgent manner.
The next topic is managing your workstation. So if you don't already have one, please go create and use a secure baseline image. Not only does it make your life easier from an operational perspective to start with a good, clean, fresh image, but it is important to make sure that we don't continue to introduce security vulnerabilities that we've already patched into your environment through the issuance of new systems. So if you spent all the time fixing the systems that were affected by Log4j, but you didn't update your baseline image for a workstation or a server, then you might have those vulnerable systems back in your environment again. Follow a regular patching cycle for all operating systems. Pick a test group of systems. Apply the patches right away when they're released. Everybody should be aware of at least when Patch Tuesday is, and for example, and then apply patches to that test group. Look for adverse behavior. If none are detected, then move on to patching the remainder of your systems. And much of this can be automated. You can schedule these installations and just understand that there's probably going to be a human element to the testing aspect.
So the next topic is looking at host-based intrusion, IDS, IPS, endpoint detection, and how those systems respond. You want to make sure to look at, to configure and to monitor your logs from workstations, and through the system logs and look for increased prevention and looking at the detection capabilities. The most important part is understanding the systems that you have and getting alerted from the different layers of defenses that you're putting in. So you have your logs from your endpoint systems, your workstations, your laptops, you have the logs from your firewalls. If you do have the IDS and IPS systems, they're going to go through and be able to correlate those logs and raise alerts to help your security team and your network teams respond a lot faster. Apply that continuous monitoring, send alerts to your syslog servers, your SIM tools to help and look at your internal activity in your network and even the external facing systems that open the door for folks to come into your network. Making sure you deploy anti-malware solutions on workstations to prevent spyware, adware, and other malware that's, as Chris was pointing to, from the security baseline. So you have a baseline, and when you have a compromised system or workstation or server, you can compare what's happened to that device to your baseline and try and figure out what's going on with the system. Monitor your antivirus scan results on a regular basis and the reports that you get from your IDS and IPS systems. From a server management standpoint, you want to create, again, those baseline images, as Chris was talking about. You want to go through and most importantly, upgrade those systems, otherwise decommission or end of life those servers that you have, especially if they're running 2003 or older. You want to implement that best practice in regards to asset and patch management processes. And you want to make sure that you're going through and disabling all unnecessary services that are not being utilized, especially for those externally facing services or resources that you have. This slide talks a little bit more about server configuration and logging. The syslog side, it will establish your retention and at the same time reduce the number of cache credentials to 0. Going through and looking at configuring and monitoring those system logs via the centralized SIM that we were talking about, and actually looking at explicitly denying use of the user profiles. So you can restrict a lot of the web traffic from servers and anonymous shares, and also look at restricting admin modes for remote credential guard. Turning that feature will help further secure remote desktop sessions, especially against those pass-to-hash attacks. You want to limit remote access by only using jump servers for such access. Having that jump server will actually give you an ability to centralize your logging so that you have a gateway, so to speak, to monitor. So looking at those logs from the jump server will give you the ability to go through. And then if they are accessing servers from different resources, that should be an alert as well, since your process or your procedure is to utilize the jump server to communicate to your systems. On the Linux side, make sure you're using SC Linux or AppArmor to enforce the mode and or turn on audit logging. It's very important to go through, turn on bash shell logging again, and send those logs to your SIM. Don't allow users to use SU, use sudo instead. It actually gives more logging and runs with finer controls. configure your automatic updates, and at the same time runs your mounts for no executables or no execution.
Right, changes. So having a change control process in place, whether it's a simple one or a complex one, as long as it's consistently followed, and it ensures the changes to the environment don't introduce new risks or reintroduce vulnerabilities, as we spoke about earlier. And it also just gives you that record of what's changed in your organization. Even in times of the need for rapid change, change control is still a necessity, and it will pay for itself. All right, so make sure that your firewalls are not only configured to capture log traffic in and out of your network, but if possible, let's capture that traffic between those distinct internal network segments. That helps you put a complete picture, make a complete picture of those threats coming in from the internet, and also if there's suspicious lateral movement in there as well. And next slide. All right, and then let's see. So make sure that your network equipment is configured to only allow encrypted management sessions like SSH, and disable insecure sessions like Telnet, and make sure that equipment is only accessible from trusted network locations.
Go through and evaluate and consider the security configurations on the Microsoft O365 side and other cloud service platforms prior to actually deploying them, making sure that you cover the necessary steps to help add layers of defense, ultimately utilizing multi-factor authentication should be one of your first lines of defense. To help best mitigate techniques and to prevent against credential theft. Using the principle of least privilege will help protect global admins and normal admins from compromise. Looking at enabling unified audit logging in the Security and Compliance Center will help go through and increase the alerts from that perspective, and enabling alerting capabilities. And then again, talking about centralizing your log management using a SIM solution. And one of the most important parts is looking at your environment and disabling legacy protocols if they're not required, or limit their use as much as possible to just specific users. If you have legacy systems that still need to operate from a business perspective, but at the same time, remember that those are also weak points and can cause access to the adversaries. And then you have host recommendations. You want to implement policies to block workstations to communicate to other workstations through RDP, remote desktop. You can utilize Windows GPOs or similar mechanisms. Again, store those system logs especially of mission critical systems for at least 1 year within a SIM tool. Again, sometimes there's budgetary limitations, so knowing what you can, but then also knowing from a regulation standpoint, knowing what you need to hold and store is important. So reviewing the configuration of application logs to verify that their recording fields will contribute to an incident, and response investigation is very important, because that's the data that you'll be utilizing to prove or to help understand how the attack is happening.
And just like we talked about having, this is probably the third reference to it now, just like we talked about having secure server and workstation baseline images, the same principle should be applied to all of your network equipment. Remove old code bases and images from those devices if they're not needed. Typically, They can have several versions of operating systems and just boot into the most recent one. Remove those once you know that they're not needed, and keep a baseline configuration up to date, and so that it addresses the vulnerabilities that you've already addressed, the configuration changes, the secure configuration changes that you've made over the time, and just use the latest stable code version of those network devices, and keep them up to date with security updates. So there's a lot of difference. There's a much different use case, risk appetite. For example, student computer lab, your P servers. These are the people who access them. Organization, and there are security precautions taken no matter what part of the White House you're in. But the closer you get to the Oval Office or the Situation Room, there may be more access that you have to have as you're funneled through all of these different security checkpoints. A visitor that arrives for a tour doesn't get a free reign throughout the whole place. There are layers of security, and so should it be with your network. Proper network segmentation is an excellent way to slow down or stop an intruder altogether who get a foothold on your network.
So user management is another tactic to look at, and best practice. Reducing the number of domain and enterprise administrator accounts, creating non-privileged accounts for privileged users, for those privileged users that we're talking about. And also take a look at technical methods to detect and prevent browsing by those privileged accounts. Utilizing web proxies would enable blocking of domain admins. Utilizing two-factor authentication to go through, and if soft tokens are used, make sure that they don't exist on the same device that is requesting the remote access, because if that device gets compromised, then it will likely let the intruders through. Some additional things from a user management standpoint is creating privileged role tracking, making sure you introduce those change control processes that Chris was referring to before, to track all privilege escalations and role changes, so you know what's happening to each account that requires those escalated privileges. So those are documented. In case you run into an account that you don't have documentation for, that could be a canary, so to speak, an indication that you may have a compromised account. Enable alerts on privilege escalation and role changes to help also monitor those situations, and log all privileged user changes to help alert for those unusual events. And we're always talking about least privilege controls, but the other part is implementing that security awareness training program with regular communications to your end users, because remember, those are your first lines of defense that usually can help you and alert you to an incident.
So going back to network segmentation, there are two kind of ways to do this, and they work hand in hand. So you definitely need to have a physical separation. So place a physical device like a router or a firewall between physical network segments. This gives you an ingress egress point that can be monitored. And on the opposite side of that is going to be the virtual separation. And so logically separate devices from one another. Next slide, Armando. Logically separate devices from one another. That's a useful technique to isolate a device into its own private VLAN and limit its ability to work with other machines. So, essentially, you're isolating an infected or compromised device. So there's both the physical and the virtual side of things to take into consideration.
So, taking a look at some common missteps an organization can make when first responding, mitigating the affected systems before responders can actually protect or recover the data, touching adversary infrastructure and alerting them that you're there can cause them to hide or go away or pause their attack. So taking a look at making sure that you don't go through those steps, preemptively blocking adversary infrastructure, or even resetting credentials. Some other steps are looking at failure to preserve or collect the log data. If you're not collecting those logs in your SIM or not retaining those logs long enough, those are issues that will come along and bite you. And communicating over the same network as the incident response channel is probably one of the bigger ones, because sometimes if they actually have folks that have infiltrated into those networks, they're probably already listening to what communications are happening, and that'll go against you. And then only fixing the symptoms and not looking for that root cause. Where was the actual compromise at? Was it at a software or a hardware layer, or was it from a phishing campaign? So knowing those common missteps and looking out for them will help you go through the process of responding in a better manner. One of the other mitigation guidances is quarantining and reimaging compromised hosts. Note, as we were talking about some of the missteps, you may want to proceed caution to avoid adverse effects that may indicate or help the incident handling section. So you want to monitor and educate users to be cautious of third-party sites, utilize web content filtering where you can to block those known and bad domains. You want to sanitize removable media. You want to go through and investigate network shares and how they're accessible by the users, and improve existing network-based malware detection tools, and even utilizing sandboxing capabilities.
Right. So one of the, go back a slide, Armando. That's all right. I can speak to it. There we go. So FTP and Telnet are not secure protocols. FTP is used for transferring of files. Telnet is used for remote sessions. Everything happens in plain text with these protocols. So make sure that they're replaced with their secure counterparts, SFTP or SSH. And then from a VPN perspective, we generally think of VPN as a good thing, but when VPNs are used and that are outside of your organization's ability to monitor, it may be the bad guys trying to keep their actions private and hidden. So funnel legitimate VPN needs through approved VPN solutions, and block the rest of them.
Going through and disabling unnecessary ports, protocols, and services is very important. If you're not utilizing it, don't let it be a source of attack, and restrict inbound and outbound access to ports and protocols that do not need to be utilized, as well as going through and creating an access list to assets that are justified by business use. And enable your firewall logs for inbound and outbound network traffic as well, to go through and monitor those logs. Service accounts are very important. You want to restrict and disable interactive login for service accounts. If a service account gets compromised, you want to make sure that they're not able to log into a system. It's a very precious target for attackers aiming to obtain credentials. You want to go through and audit AD to identify and document active service accounts. Disallow interactive login by adding the service accounts to a group of non-interactive login users. That helps with the ability not to log in, and continuously monitor those situations. go through and disable unnecessary remote network administration tools. Attackers can gain access to remote users' computers by stealing that off data, the login and password, and hijack active remote administration setups. By gaining that unrestricted control of the enterprise network environment, when the attackers can compromise the hosts as a relay server and use them for reverse connections into their networks. Those administration tools can basically connect them from anywhere. So remove all remote administration tools that are not being required for day-to-day operations, and closely monitor the log events as we spoke about before.
Right, and so RDP directly to a workstation or a server should not be accessible from the internet. If you do have a need for something like that, make sure that you use a secure remote desktop gateway to increase that security, or even better yet, make that remote desktop resource only available behind after logging in through an approved VPN solution.
Looking at credential resets and access policies, make sure you review them. Credential resets strategically basically ensure that all compromised accounts and devices are included in those resets, and will reduce the likelihood of attacker can adapt to the situation. Force password resets and revoke any issue of certs for affected accounts or devices. If the domain controller is compromised, all passwords for those local accounts need to be reset. If you're actually looking at the ntds.dit file, if it's suspected to be exfiltrated, then the case to actually reset all domain user passwords must be done. And making sure that you review those access policies to temporarily revoke those privileges on affected accounts and devices is very important. If you're looking at not trying to alert an attacker, then the privileges can be reduced for the affected accounts or devices to basically try and contain them. Looking at patch management, make sure you patch all software and system vulnerabilities. Using a patch management lifecycle and the change control process is very important. Known vulnerabilities for externally facing services need to be patched immediately in a priority there. And looking if the point of compromise is known, but if it's not, but if the exploit is unknown, then try and contact the vendor so that they can begin analysis and help develop a new patch. It may be something that they need to be, a patch that needs to be created. Always follow vendor remediation guidance as soon as it becomes available. So we leave you with 12 things that you can do right now to improve your cybersecurity. You want to tighten your security controls at access points. You want to be able to go through and either utilize web application firewalls as another layer of defense, block certain files from being downloaded, and make sure you tighten other security controls. Touch base with your software as a service providers for any precautionary steps that they can help you provide answers to how you can better protect your software. Always advise your help desk to assist users after they've actually done two-factor authentication, so it verifies who they are. And then not only looking at your high and critical patches, but also looking at those medium and low ones for externally facing devices are just as important, because those vulnerabilities will allow those attackers to come through. Leverage threat intelligence. Maintain up-to-date list of indicators of compromise, as we talked about, and then put incident response vendors on standby in case the situation comes around that they are not available, and be ready. Practice your tests as much as possible. Ensure everyone has a hard copy of your incident response in case communication breakdowns, and ensure that the storage team has those isolated backups, as Chris was talking about, to make sure that you're able to restore your data efficiently.
Right, and this is, do we have any questions? We did cover a lot today. We tried to break it down a little bit at the end there. Let's see here.
So one from the chat, Chris, can you expand on what tools/practices help reduce cached credentials and what the difference was between laptop and desktop systems in that regard?
Well, let me start by covering a couple of things. So some practices that you can have to reduce the cached credentials. You know, a standard user, the risk of having cached credentials of a standard user is low. But if you say, for example, are an administrative user, you're in IT, or you have elevated privileges, and you sign into workstations or laptops or servers, typically without further steps, your credentials are cached, and therefore they can, if the attacker has access to that system and has access to where those are stored, they can dump them and then crack them and then use them to move from one resource to another. So if you have an easy practice is to have two accounts, a user account and an administrative account, and you only invoke that when needed. But there is an Active Directory group for privileged users, and that essentially doesn't allow those cached credentials to be stored. If I'm getting that right, Armando.
You got it right on the head.
Thank you. Hopefully that helps, Greg. And at this time, too, feel free to come off mute if you have any questions to ask of Armando and Chris, too.
While we're waiting for perhaps any other questions, if you go back a slide, Armando, I wanted to remind everyone that that Forelli participates in the 1% pledge organization, and we have pledged to provide 100 hours of complimentary security services for any higher education institution that falls victim to a cyber attack. So, you know, we take a very community-oriented approach to this. So an attack on one higher education institution is an attack on all of our higher education institutions collectively, and we think that's criminal, and it shouldn't be always up to the institution to have to figure that out themselves. So if you are an institution that finds yourself in that situation, please feel free to reach out if you do need assistance. And we're of course trying to provide these educational webinars. Maybe you put that one extra precaution in place and can prevent that terrible outcome. But we're here for you if you need us.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Randy. I had just a quick question. So, excuse me, you were speaking about the jump gateway for remote desktop. So we have something like that set up for users that are off campus. Do you recommend even having something like that on network if they're on campus? And I only bring this up because we were even recently informed we should be having MFA required for even all of our local server access.
You want to take this one, Armando, or you want me to give it a crack?
No, definitely going through, and again, it's another layer of defense that you can add, another step that you can add to restrict. At the same time, it's also a way to look at it as a gatekeeper. If you're only allowing access through your network through a certain jump server, you're monitoring that one system and having to look at those logs a little more intensely, but at the same time, at least they're concentrated. And it'll help you also create alerts for accounts that shouldn't be utilizing those services. So it is another layered defense. It all depends on how the network is set up and how isolated you have segmented, like Chris was talking about before. So all that comes into play when you're trying to set that up.
And and a mitigating control to the difficulty of having multi-factor authentication, like on the actual sign-in of a server, is to put those in their own segment and require MFA on the way in. So that's
exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
It's a goal to look forward to. There are products and solutions out there that can help with that, but it is a common challenge. It's not the most straightforward thing that you can do. So putting those mitigating controls in place is what you can do today as you try to grow and follow those security best practices to a T.
Yeah. And it's also a change for the network team or the server administrators, but at the same time raising that awareness and making sure that they understand why it's important to have those services to help protect the institution and add another layer of defense. It is very important.
Yeah, honestly, our biggest challenge will probably be the administrators not being happy about that change, but
yeah,
it makes sense to me. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Certainly.
I have a question regards to avoiding these common missteps. And by the way, thank you so much for the great job you guys did as far as providing this information. But my question in regards to the common mistakes is that you're saying do not alert the attacker that you're aware of them doing certain things. Now, what would you do in a situation you have a machine, you don't have a quarantine network or anything of that nature to kind of quarantine the machine? What kind of advice would you give on that behalf if you do happen to run into a compromised situation as such?
That's a very good question. Looking at what you can do to go through it, I think one of the things that you should always try and do if you have your insurance provider going through from an incident standpoint, they will have recommendations for you for certain situations and how to try to respond to an attack. They'll also know your environment, so they can give you a hand in those types of scenarios. But again, you're trying to isolate something, so you need to be able to do such a thing, and you need to set up your network in order to be able to accommodate that. So if it requires you to rethink and get your team together to try and create such a quarantined place, you're better off trying to do it now while you're not under attack than during an incident.
And I think there's a little bit, sometimes your hands are tied. You need to isolate an infected machine, right? So if that alerts the attacker, that alerts the attacker. It's the difference of if you know that a user account is compromised, you don't necessarily want to send out an all user blast that we have a compromised account, because then that person gets that notification. So withholding information, playing your cards close to your chest, so to speak, is really the idea there. Whatever you can do to not alert them that they're found until you have the ability to take the action that isolates them or takes their access away. That's kind of I think that's the heart of what Armando was getting to.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I was thinking along the same mindset regards to that as well, for future reference for like unhygiene machines, machines not in compliance with updates or something of that nature, to quarantine them in a zone until they get their act together, and then they're allowed back to access the network as a healthy machine. So I was just thinking along the same route as that.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, you don't want to alert them to press the encrypt button, so to speak,
Correct.
before you go through it, and then you don't have an option to respond. So, it's important to try and weigh those odds. Do you actually let them know that you're there or not? And you need to keep that in mind in the background while you're operating. So it is a tricky balance at the same time, but it depends on the situation. It depends on the attacker and how much of a foothold do they actually have on your network. So all those things come into play when you're trying to make those decisions. So it's very important to make sure that you have not only the IT folks, but the business folks together so that you can operate and make decisions together to get the outcome that you're looking for.
Appreciate the feedback.
So there's another question
from the chat.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
From Tim, do you work with clients' existing SIEM, AV, et cetera, or have a prescribed set of tools that you require?
Right. So if we work with the school, the schools that we work with today have a variety of these tools. There are some that in our experience work better than others in different situations. But also it a lot of times comes down to the skill set that the team has, their familiarity with those tools, how much they cost, and the size and complexity of the organization. So there's not a one size fits all for any of this. And we're happy to provide informed opinions on these things if you wanted to ask, particular to your situation, I would say.
We've got a great group of folks that are willing to learn new things as well. So I'm always impressed in how they're their hunger to learn new things.
Okay, then a question from Eugene from the chat as well. How to get school administrators involved with these practices?
Talk about it all the time. Not in a the sky is falling way, but talk about what what's happening out there. If there is a regular meeting that you can get on, if there is a IT governance, any of get it in with the with any of the employee groups and talk about the things that you see, the things that they should know. And it goes back to what Armando talked about a bunch of times today, which is the end user awareness, and then those concerns bubble up, from a grassroots perspective, up to the leadership. And also, and also have those conversations with leadership so that they're not surprised when you come to them with a problem that you need their help, typically in the terms of funding or maybe a policy or guideline change. These are the reasons that we that we need to make this change. And so
I would say, to add to that, I would say practice. Going through the process of actually trying to recover a system and mimicking what might happen, I think will raise a lot of questions and help you understand where the communication channels need to be in order to respond to an incident a lot more. So the more practice that you have, the better off you are. And the different scenarios that you practice will help you develop your response and help develop the communication channels that need to be there.
And one more suggestion I would have too is, for example, for an organization that doesn't have multi-factor authentication in place across the board, make sure that you are sharing each and every compromised user account that comes across that comes out. Share those with your finance folks, with your human resources folks, your student services folks, so they're aware of the frequency of those and the impact. And the understanding of that will bring their knowledge to your level and help them understand where you're coming from.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. And Armando, another question from the chat. Would you recommend implementing a 15-character password minimum if it meant disabling password expiration? This is a highly debated topic here.
All right, let's see if we have alignment. So from my understanding, and I hear this quoted a lot of times. NIST came out and said, stop requiring password changes, and everybody loves hearing that. except the background on that is when you have strong password requirements and you have multi-factor authentication in place and not for privileged users. So your general user base, that's a decent trade-off, but there is definitely going to be some things to put in place first, a robust multi-factor authentication system to sort of offset that risk. That is my take on it. What do you think, Armando?
I definitely think, again, having that multi-factor authentication, especially for your privileged accounts, is definitely a barrier that helps. But at the same time, it takes a lot. And it's not so much the character limit itself. If the account gets compromised and that information, the account password is divulged, it doesn't matter how long it is. It's going to be accessible. So not having to change it as often, again, it's that tiered approach, I think, that would help, making sure that you have increased character amounts for your privileged accounts, say 20 or more, and looking at how to balance it out. It is a balancing act, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it's hard for them to not guess the password.
Right, and that plays back into the user awareness. So if you could implement 15 character passwords and turn off, automatic expiration, but also some user education around, please don't reuse this password for anything else, because that's where it comes into play. They'll use it on an account that doesn't have MFA and use the same password or a guessable variation, and that's where the password gets guessed and compromised. So.
One of the other things you may want to consider is also using a password management tool. It makes it easier, especially for the user accounts and administrative accounts that have to remember so many. It's a way to securely maintain the passwords and securely utilize them. So that's another option. Obviously, there's a cost that's associated to that, but at the same time, it makes it easier to remember those accounts and passwords.
Okay, another question from chat from Randy this time. Recommended password reset tools.
So whatever tool is used just needs to have some security built into it. So a lot of schools have say an Office 365 deployment, Exchange Online, maybe some SharePoint Online. Maybe you already have Azure AD SSO. Maybe you're using Azure for MFA as an example. It's a common scenario we see, and there's a great built-in password reset functionality. Typically, you need to have two ways that the user proves that they're themselves before the password's reset. Whether that's a security question and a text message code, or an email to an alternative email, code sent to an alternative email, and an app notification, something along those lines, just to prove that person's them, and then the password change happens. But it needs to be both secure and very user friendly, because password resets, as we know, are a very common help desk item, and we don't want to overwhelm those folks.
Having that capability of actually resetting the passwords from the internet, since a lot of work from home, making sure that they've either connected through a VPN or a secure measure to go through those channels also helps.
Are there any other questions that we could field today? It's a great set of questions. I really appreciate the engagement. All right. Well, as Kelly and Armando said, this session was recorded and will be available. So if you know of anyone who might benefit from seeing the recorded version, go ahead and contact us. The contact information is on the screen, and if you need any more information or would like some assistance, you can reach out to us as well.
Thanks, everyone.
We hope to see you on future webinars. Thank you so much.